title of my talk tonight. There are 15 species of cranes in the world. Most of them are in Asia and Africa, but actually the family originated in North America. The closest relative to the crane is the limpkin, and those birds are found in southern Florida and all around the Caribbean. But for whatever reason, the cranes got into Asia, and because of the huge land mass and the variety of habitats in Asia and Africa, evolved into these beautiful creatures, leaving just 2 species in North America. Although we used to have many species of crowned cranes, the beautiful cranes that are now only in Africa. We have their skeletons and their eggs at various deposits in North America. Anyway, in North America today, we have just 2 kinds of cranes. The sandhill crane, the most abundant crane on Earth, and the whooping crane, the rarest. So how did that happen? Here they are together. The whooping crane is a white bird with black wingtips. The sandhill crane is a gray bird. They both have red on their foreheads. And I want to give a little ornithology lesson. Up in Nova Scotia, this is what they call a crane, but it's actually a great blue heron, which is a common bird here. This is how a great blue heron flies, with their neck bent. Cranes, at least our cranes in North America, don't land in trees. Of course, herons do, and they nest in trees. This is the sandhill crane. And it's a pearly gray bird, but they do the most unusual thing in the spring. They pick up mud that's rich in iron, and they paint it on their feathers. And the iron dries and oxidizes and chemically links with the pigment of the feather, permanently staining those feathers this beautiful cinnamon color. The natural color is the top of the neck, a light gray. And when the sandhill crane sits on its eggs in the middle of the marsh, they nest in the wetland, not in trees like herons. They look like a wet muskrat house, or an old muskrat house, and they're very, very difficult to see, because often sandhill cranes will nest in very small marshes, sometimes very near to people. There are about 5,000 sandhill cranes living in Florida, and often they're nesting in golf courses and so on. Well, this is the distribution of our sandhill cranes. We have 6 different subspecies, the rarest of which is in Mississippi, only 100 birds left. We have about 5,000 in Florida and about 650 at various locations in Cuba, a unique subspecies. Then we have this great horde of sandhill cranes in the western and northern areas of our continent, extending 2,000 miles into Russia. Birds that migrate all the way back into Alaska and down into western Texas for the winter. The greatest gathering of cranes on Earth happens every March in Nebraska, when we have about 600,000 cranes on 40 miles of river. The earth shakes when these birds fly, and it's an absolute roar when they are in the air. Now, if we could have this other video. I took this video. The cranes just flew up from their roost, but this gives you, whoops, an idea. Oops. I'm going to go back here. It's not. There it is. Okay. And this goes on for 40 miles along the Platte River. It's one of the world's great ornithological spectacles. Okay. And this sandhill crane has expanded its range to eastern North America in recent years. And they are now nesting in Maine and New Brunswick, and in Pennsylvania and northern state New York and in Vermont. Not very many. And I just found out a few days ago that perhaps 75 birds are wintering on the Ace Basin at one location. So you may see them around your island at some point. They love agricultural fields, so maybe in your horse paddocks you'll see sandhill cranes. Now we're going to talk about the whooping crane, the big white crane. And if you see white birds out in the marshes here in the winter, as Larry said, there are whooping cranes occasionally, but you have lots of these birds, the egrets, that are also arboreal. They nest in the trees, and their young are helpless until they can fly. In contrast, the whooping cranes fly with their necks straight out. It's not bent. They're about this tall, huge bird. Their voice carries for several miles, and they have these black wingtips. The wood stork, all of the flight feathers are black, but in the whooping crane, only the first 12, or the primary flight feathers. This is my home in Wisconsin, the Baraboo Hills area. And this is our 230-acre headquarters of the Crane Foundation. In the foreground is Crane City. It's surrounded by a predator-proof fence to keep out the raccoons. And we have 61 crane dominiums, each of which has a pair of cranes. And one of the streets is called Whooping Crane Way. Between Crane City and the road, way out there, we have 110 acres of restored prairie. This part of Wisconsin used to be covered by prairie and oak savanna. And halfway up on the right, you'll see a circular building. That's where you can see all 15 species of cranes, including the whooping crane at the Amico Whooping Crane exhibit, which we opened in 1995. The amphitheater, as you look out, is sunken, and there's deep water surrounding it, so the cranes can't walk in and peck somebody. They come within 10 feet before the drop-off, which the visitor doesn't see. And then they build their nests in the shallow water. So as you look out, you see the sky, the forest, the prairie, and the wetland. And now we'll have one more little video. This is the dance of the whooping crane. Cranes are unique among large birds like this in that they have these beautiful courtship dances. And it's a way of keeping a strong pair bond between the male and the female. And dances are most often performed by young cranes that are just sort of getting their act together, sort of like humans, don't you think? Old timers that know how to copulate and everything seldom dance. The call of the whooping crane is quite diagnostic. It really sounds like whoop, and they do a duet which sounds like this. Whoop, 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 and the whoop is the female, and the big whoop is the male. And that is another display that sort of bonds the birds together and helps them in their daily lives to defend their territories. They do unison calls when other cranes are flying over, which means keep going. And their inner wing feathers are very elaborate. They can elevate them like a rooster's tail, and they do this during some of their displays. Their most dramatic display is called the butterfly threat. They come running towards you, whoop, whoop. Then they start running on the spot with their wings back, exposing the red on their head and this wall of white. And this is a strong signal that you're not supposed to be there either. Well, that is the former range of the whooping crane. The red area is the breeding area, which was the tall grass prairie zone of the United States and Canada. Their breeding area extended from northern Indiana. The greatest concentrations of nests were in Iowa, and then up through Minnesota into Saskatchewan and Alberta. And the wintering areas, the Carolinas, Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf Coast, and the high plateau of Mexico. We think there may have been as many as 10,000 whooping cranes when Europeans came to this continent. We have a very, very interesting report from North Carolina of the Native Americans keeping whooping cranes as pets. If you capture a whooping crane in the wild, they really never tame down. The only way to make a pet is to take the egg or the chick and raise it. So perhaps on the savannas of the Carolinas, the whooping cranes once nested. And Catesby does have a whooping crane in his book, the first bird book. So the breeding area is in Wood Buffalo National Park, way up in Canada, and the whooping cranes fly 2,700 miles to winter at this one little spot in Texas. That's all that we have left of the whooping crane in the original wild populations. That's the population flying along that line that was reduced to just 15 individuals in 1940. This is a little more detailed map. The dark green is the taiga zone, and you can see the dots are the former nesting areas on the prairies. And there was this concentration where there was much more water than in the drier shortgrass prairies, which are the light yellow. Cranes were very important to various tribes of Native Americans. This is actually a sandhill crane representing the Sandhill tribe in northern Wisconsin. That line is Lake Superior, and in 1849, the chiefs of these various tribes went to Washington with this picture to present to the President of the United States. And it said, "We, the tribes of northern Wisconsin, are united intellectually and spiritually, as indicated by these lines, from the heart and from the head. And we would like the wetlands and the forests of northern Wisconsin as a permanent home for our tribes." Well, the settlers poured into the tall grass prairies in the 1800s. And you can imagine you're in a covered wagon in early spring, going to your little plot of land where you hope to plant potatoes that are going to get you through the next winter, building a sod hut with your children out there trying to survive. There are no stores. And a big animal is a big meal. And the whooping cranes were simply obliterated, as were the bison and the trumpeter swans, and so on the tall grass prairies. However, when the bird became very rare, the next threat were the museum people, with the philosophy that it's better to have a whooping crane stuffed and preserved in our museum than to let it rot in the wild. And the last pair, 1922, in Saskatchewan, was shot and their eggs collected and placed in a museum. But there were still whooping cranes. They still appeared in Texas in the winter, and we never knew where they bred until 1954, when during a survey for forest fires over Wood Buffalo National Park, established for the wood bison, they looked down and saw these huge white birds. They didn't know what they were. Biologists came back and found a few pairs of whooping cranes breeding there. Out in these little marshes, surrounded by black spruce, in an area with no clear flow of water through it, two rivers come into this basin and just disperse, creating this mosaic of habitat. Almost impenetrable in the summer because there's no water course going through it. This is where the whooping cranes were safe. And I want to tell you a little story about myself. I'm sitting in a one-room classroom in Nova Scotia. There are 10 grades in one room, and every Friday at 10 o'clock we had Science of the Air on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It was on for half an hour, and in the spring of 1954, the year the whooping cranes were discovered, the program was a dramatization of a pair of whooping cranes. And the actors were talking to each other about all the dangers they faced during migration from the museum people and from the settlers and from power lines and whatever. Finally, they get to their wilderness where nobody knows where they are. Isn't it great to be back home, sweetie? Nobody knows where we are. And then you hear this airplane, and the female crane starts screaming, they found us, they're going to come and kill us and put us in a drawer in a museum. And then the male says, oh no, honey, this is Wood Buffalo Park, but this is the Canadian Wildlife Service, and we're going to be safe here. But that program had a lasting impact on me because I worried about whooping cranes ever since. And who would have thunk that this little kid in Nova Scotia, and they don't even have cranes in Eastern Canada at that time, would do what I did with my life to help the cranes. The whooping cranes only lay 2 eggs a year. And both male and female assist in incubating. Usually the female incubates during the night, and they exchange several times during the day. The incubation period is about 32 days, and both chicks usually hatch. But then a strange thing happens. They take the older chick from the nest and sometimes abandon the second chick or the second egg, and it's often killed by crows. Sometimes they'll raise 2 chicks, but very, very seldom. It seems that the second egg is simply an insurance policy. You have to concentrate on the first one in order to fledge a chick. They then begin their migration. The little dots indicates the distance they flew in a single day when this bird was followed by radio telemetry across the Great Plains. And now we have a two new challenges along the migration route. You'll notice that it covers northern Alberta before the birds swing into into Saskatchewan. That is the area of the oil sands extraction. And there are large lakes of toxic material that the whooping cranes could land in and become greatly threatened by it. So we're very nervous about them flying over that area. And now, as they come into the Dakotas, the big challenge are forests of wind machines, wind farms, that we're very, very concerned about. So we've been doing a lot of radio telemetry of the whooping cranes to try to define the safest areas, or the most important areas for the birds, and to advise that wind farms not be located in that kind of habitat. This is an aerial view of a place in Nebraska, and those little ponds are where the whooping cranes like to stop. Now they don't fly in a big flock, they just fly as a family group, or maybe if they're subadults, you'll find 7 or 8 in a flock. These little ponds are surrounded by cornfields or soybean fields, and the whooping cranes will feed on the waste grain, roost in the pond at night, but then continue on very rapidly towards their wintering ground, which is one of the most beautiful complexes along the coast of Texas. It's called the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. It's a huge set of wetlands that is maintained by the inflow of a freshwater river called the Guadalupe, not far from Corpus Christi. And the whooping crane is very, very water dependent. Unlike the sandhill crane that will often feed in upland areas, The whooping cranes will do that during their migration, but when they get to Texas, they are fixated upon blue crabs. And I'm sure a lot of you are too. But this little animal lives in the brackish water. And our big threat now to the whooping crane is diversion of the freshwater inflow for human use from the Guadalupe River. And the marshes during drought years become much too saline, and the blue crabs go to deeper water where the whooping cranes can't get them. And during the winter of 2008, 2009, we lost 23 whooping cranes to starvation during that drought. Well, they have these beautiful displays, and they use them to proclaim their 500-acre territories. This is the invisible boundary between two pairs that are displaying. Don't come over that line. And if you do, this is what might happen to you. The photographer, Mike Sloat, was in a boat, and a whooping crane pair landed where they shouldn't have landed, and the resident male attacked. This is the display he went through. He is, normally a crane will fly like this, but during this display, it's like this. It's very, very, very stiff. And he ends with this enormous flap of his wings, which you can hear for quite a distance. It's like a whoop. The feathers make a sound, and the red is exposed and facing towards the other crane. And then he goes into this beautiful butterfly threat display with his wings held back and the red extended to the other bird. You can sort of think of whooping cranes like tigers. You'll have an area where there are a lot of deer. Maybe those are like sandhill cranes that are vegetarians. Then you'll have one tiger which will have many, many square miles as his territory to produce enough food. Well, it's the same for these carnivorous birds like whooping cranes that are dependent on the blue crabs. Well, that's the Blackjack Peninsula, which is sort of the centerpiece of the whooping crane. And in 1950, those little units in red were the territories of the very few pairs of whooping cranes. There were 31 individuals and 7 territories by 1950. Now, I'm just going to go through these very quickly. In 1961, one family had moved over to Matagorda Island. By 71, we had 17 pairs with territories. By 79, we had 18. By 85, we had 28. By 1990, we had 37. By 1995, we had 49. They're moving up the coast. And by 2000, we had 57. By 2006, we had 66. And today, we have about 90 territories. And you can see how few there were in 1938. 1950, we're not even up to 50 birds. 1980, we're up to, these are the number of territories through to 2006, there were 66. And you'll notice that they're sort of on a 10-year cycle. They increase and then take a dip, and increase and then take a dip, and increase and take a dip. And this correlates to the cycle of rabbits in Wood Buffalo National Park. The rabbits increase, the lynx and the wolf increase, the rabbits crash for whatever reason, and we think that perhaps these top predators then take more subadult whooping cranes. So we have this cycle of their population following the predator-prey of mammals in Wood Buffalo National Park. So just to review, they have the spring migration, the arrival at Wood Buffalo National Park. They build their nests, they lay their 2 eggs, they hatch their chicks, they raise them on animal food in the marsh, they fly, As family groups in the fall, they arrive in Texas at Aransas Refuge, and they go for the blue crabs, and the chicks remain with their parents throughout the winter, and then as a family group, they fly back to northern Canada. The chick either leaves its parents or it's driven away by its parents when they arrive back at their nesting area. I think you all can relate to that. You see, cranes are very humanoid. One genus of cranes is called anthropoides because they're so similar to people. And people love to see whooping cranes. About $15 million comes into the local communities along the coast of Texas. People coming down to see the cranes, to take the tour boats out, to photograph the cranes. The intercoastal canal goes right through the center of the refuge. The birds are used to the traffic, and you can get very, very close to the birds. But these barges carry toxic chemicals, and should there be an accident, we could lose most of our whooping cranes within a few hours. So that is a great risk. I'd like to invite you to join me in late February, the last weekend every year. Next year we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Whooping Crane Festival. We meet in Port Aransas. We have various lectures and activities, bird watching, and boat trips out to see the whooping cranes. So what are the risks to the whooping cranes today? I told you something about the migration, but one of our great concerns is sea level rise, and I'm sure you're very concerned about that where you're living here too. We have a plan. We have 2 staff full-time in Texas working on a plan called 1,000 Whooping Cranes. We hope the population will continue to increase. If the sea level rises, areas now that are forest will become salt marshes. So it's very important to conserve those areas through land easements and whatever in areas between Corpus Christi and Houston, Galveston area along that coast. So we are working on that in a proactive manner. If we don't do that and sea level rises, all of those shallow wetlands where the whooping cranes are now feeding will be too deep for them. So we're all connected in this big, beautiful ball orbiting through space. And in 1973, thanks to Russell Train, a great environmentalist who was selected by President Nixon to head the Center for Environmental Quality, we had several important acts passed in this country. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act put some teeth into providing laws to protect species like the whooping cranes and their ecosystems, like the wetlands along the coast of Texas. So, how are we going about this since 1973? Well, we wanted to establish a captive flock of whooping cranes by collecting their eggs, collecting 1 egg from each nest with 2 eggs. These were sort of expendable, and so eggs were collected starting in 1966 and taken from Wood Buffalo Park to Maryland to a facility operated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. For 10 years, they built up the population, and finally, in 1976, they had their first eggs, 10 years later. In 1989, the population was divided, and this huge military transport plane, C-130, half of the birds were brought to Baraboo, Wisconsin, to the International Crane Foundation. We maintain the whooping cranes in spacious enclosures. We rotate them so they're on fresh soil every year. This is Crane City, and every day keepers come out and they check the food and they give them a fresh bucket of water. They have little ponds in their pens, but they prefer to drink clean water from fresh water provided every day. We have very cold winters, but we do not have to heat the whooping cranes. The buildings are insulated. The birds go in at night. Sometimes we lock them in if there's a storm. And we have local people give us Christmas trees to put around their pens in the spring. They feel a little more comfortable, and if we have to catch a bird for artificial insemination, we just push them up against the branches and grab them. We have to do a lot of artificial insemination because the males have to fly up and balance on the female's back. It's very difficult on stilts, and so we have to do artificial insemination sometimes. And we have little ponds in their pens like this. This is in the Amico exhibit, where they build a big nest and hatch their chicks, and the public can observe the cranes rearing their young. And they're both looking for food. The chicks are quite precocious. However, every time the adult gets a juicy morsel, it will pass it to the chick to keep those legs growing. Now, in captivity, we can get many more eggs from the cranes than we can in the wild. We steal the eggs, and they continue to lay eggs. So we can maybe get 6 or 8 eggs from one pair of cranes in a year. So what do we do with these birds so we can put them back into the wild? We've developed this technique called costume and puppet rearing. And believe me, it's quite warm in those costumes in the summer, out in the marshes at the Crane Foundation. But these birds imprint on the exact features of that puppet. The rest is sort of a white blob, and I think perhaps the same thing is true with cranes in the wild. They really learn to recognize the head and the neck. Remember, the cranes always stay with their parents for about 9 months. They migrate south with their parents. They're protected by their parents. And through collaboration with a nonprofit organization from Canada, we've been able to teach these birds to migrate using ultralight aircraft, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So we have all these birds being produced in captivity. And now we're going to go back in time to the mid-70s. This is 10 years before costume rearing was invented, and before the Crane Foundation really became that involved with the whooping cranes. And back then, in 1976, whooping crane eggs were taken from Patuxent and from Wood Buffalo Park and substituted into the nests of sandhill cranes, which were abundant at Grays Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Idaho. They migrated with those birds to New Mexico. This is Grays Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and this is the arrival of whooping crane eggs in an insulated suitcase with hot water bottles under the styrofoam, high tech. And here's a beautiful sandhill crane all painted up, incubating its eggs, and the researcher removing the sandhill crane eggs and putting a single whooping crane in the nest. About 84 whooping cranes were raised in this manner by their foster parents. And there's a pair of sandhills with Junior. And there's another Junior with sandhill cranes. But these whooping cranes are only seen sandhill cranes. They learned the migration route. It was only about 700 miles compared to 2,700 miles. And they repeated exactly the migration route. They moved into the upland agricultural fields with the sandhill cranes and thrived. So they proved that they were much more flexible than we thought. But there was a great error in the whole program. Nobody realized the significance of imprinting, of learning to pair with the object to which you were associated in early life. And these whooping cranes were all imprinted on sandhill cranes, and courted sandhill cranes tried to dance with sandhill cranes and were constantly rejected because, of course, the sandhill cranes were normal. So, between 75, I'm sorry I said 76, 75 and 88, we put out 289 eggs and 84 chicks fledged, but not a single pairing occurred between a pair of whooping cranes, so the program was discontinued. So the next effort, this whole program is led by what we call the Whooping Crane Recovery Team. It includes 10 people, 5 from Canada and 5 from the United States, that get together every year to decide what we should do next to help the whooping cranes. And there's a big recovery plan, and all very well planned out. And the next effort came to Florida. By coincidence, we have 289, not eggs this time, but birds released. These are birds raised using costumes at the Crane Foundation and at Patuxent between 1993 and 2005. And they were released on the ranch land in south central Florida, not far from Orlando, in a place called the Kissimmee Prairie. These temporary enclosures were put up. There was flight netting over it and wires around it to prevent the predators, in this case bobcats especially. And the birds were held there for maybe 3 weeks. Then the flight netting was removed and the birds could fly out, but they could come back and get pelleted food if they needed it. They paired with other whooping cranes. They also fed in these upland habitats with the sandhill cranes, and they started to breed. In Florida, this is a wild sandhill crane being fed by a local guy who loved cranes, went around his little lake in a boat every day feeding pair after pair on their breeding territories. And you may have noticed how the brown pelicans and the white ibis and so many other birds have absolutely acclimated to human beings in Florida and can be approached at close range. Well, the same thing happened with the whooping cranes. But first I'm going to show you this lovely little video of a pair of whooping cranes learning how to mate. Oh, he fell off. Try again. This is their instinct. Whoops, he fell off again. Now he's learning. There's a lot of learning in this. And apparently this is the successful mating of a pair of whooping cranes on the Kissimmee Prairie in Florida. No wonder they're endangered, eh?
It takes cooperation.
Well, actually, when they get it down, it's not as dramatic. So why did this project also fail? And the reason was so many cranes flew into power lines. And there's more and more development in Florida. And there's another problem. This crane on the left doesn't have any feathers in its wings, flight feathers. Every second year, all of the flight feathers, all of those big black and white feathers, fall out within a day or two, and the bird is totally flightless for about 6 to 7 weeks. They go into the deep marshes and hide. They eat animal food until their wings have regrown, and then they can fly again. Well, the problem in Florida, we had drought, and then we had a dropping of the water table because of the use of the water by humans. More and more developments and so on. The water table went down, agricultural irrigation and so on. So some of the wetlands where the whooping cranes elected to molt would go dry. And the alligators and the whooping cranes, of course, were forced into a very small area, and we lost so many whooping cranes during the period of molting. And although they bred and produced at least 10 chicks, we stopped putting birds out there because we knew that the number of birds produced in the wild could never match the mortality of adult birds in the wild. So we had to discontinue that experiment. It's not easy in this business. So our third experiment started in 2001 to start a migratory flock between Wisconsin and the southeast. This is the release pen where birds that have been reared with costumed keepers have the birds at a refuge in central Wisconsin. And there's a short runway for ultralight aircraft to land beside. The pilots and the keepers have to wear the costume, and they train these birds to fly behind the ultralight aircraft. And it takes them about 2 months to get from Nisita to Florida. They can only fly in the early morning when there's not a breath of wind, because if it's windy, the wings of the ultralight move back and forth and can injure the cranes. So it's quite an ordeal. And this is done by an organization out of Port Perry, Ontario, Canada, called Operation Migration. But these show this map shows the location of birds in 2006 or from 2001 through 2007, and you can see there are quite a few birds along the East Coast and in the Carolinas, and these are the birds that you have been observing here. So these cranes repeat the migration route. They fly back on their own in the spring. They don't have to be led by the ultralight aircraft. And they build their nests and beautiful wetlands in the Nisita National Wildlife Refuge. Now this refuge is the remains of an ancient lake called Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. And it's very sandy, and there are very poor nutrients in the soil. But it's a huge, huge area, and we thought this would be a great place for the whooping cranes. But it turned out to be a disaster. Although we had pairs successfully rear chicks now and then, like this pair is raising 2 chicks. We've had, I think, a dozen chicks reared since 2006, and here they are in Florida with their juvenile. We have a nemesis there, black flies. There are 3 different species of black flies, and I understand that my colleague Peter Adler from Clemson spoke to you recently.
Yeah.
He has been so wonderful in helping us understand the biology of these black flies. Did he talk to you about the black flies and the whooping cranes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you know that story then. And the cranes have areas of bare skin on their breast, and they're called brood patches. And when they sit down on the eggs, they sort of pull the eggs up against that skin to be warmed up. Well, the black flies gather on the eggs, and then it's a direct hit to the whooping crane, and the birds just go berserk and leave the nests. So we did a study and found that these black flies don't live in eastern Wisconsin, where there are very fertile marshes surrounded by farmland. And since 2011, we have been releasing our birds in eastern Wisconsin. This is the migration route we thought that the whooping cranes would follow. We brought them deep into Florida, but guess what? They decided they didn't like to go that far. And a lot of the birds winter in southern Indiana. And another group in the Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alabama. And some of them have come over to South Carolina. And I am hoping that someday we can actually bring whooping cranes with the ultralight to the Ace Basin of South Carolina to build up the population. This is last year when I was down here at the Nemours Plantation. I saw this beautiful pair of birds. Unfortunately, one of these birds died, and the other bird paired with another whooping crane, but they decided to spend the winter in Indiana. Maybe they'll be back. So this experiment is in progress, and we will be continuing to put birds into this eastern flock. At the same time, we have experiment number 4. Louisiana, a land of wetlands, and from the Mississippi River to the west to the border with Texas is an enormous expanse of freshwater wetland. And in 1939, on the 15th of May, this gentleman, John Lynch, during an air survey, looked down on the marshes around an area called White Lake, and he saw a pair of whooping cranes with 2 juveniles. And that was the last breeding of the whooping crane in an area that likely had many hundreds of breeding pairs. But they were absolutely obliterated by the local people. The people lived off the land. Many of them are the French Cajun people, and the whooping cranes were good food for them. But in recent years, of course, conservation has become a top priority in Louisiana, and it has become one of the foremost waterfowl areas in the world. Oops, sorry. This is within that complex of freshwater wetlands. That's a single breeding colony of white ibis. Wow. Each of those birds dots as a nest. So, and they have hundreds of thousands of ducks winter there, and of course it's a very important hunting area. So you have these big wetlands along the coast that are still there, protected, and many of them privately owned by companies such as Amoco. And north of that, we had what was called the Cajun Prairie. And this was a mosaic of prairie and wetlands. Today, this is a major agricultural production area for rice, for cattle, and other crops. And this is a crayfish pond. Crayfish is one of the big. And Larry, you'll recognize this.
Oh, yes.
This is the hunting lodge of Amoco Corporation, which is now White Lake State Conservation Area. And they still lease this out to hunting groups who come to look for ducks. And it's very nearby on the wetland that we have put the whooping cranes. So here's the Intercoastal Canal up here. And this is the land that was owned by Amoco, and then BP, and then finally went to the state of Texas. There's agriculture up here. John Lynch saw those whooping cranes with chicks out here in 1939. The headquarters building that I just showed you is right there, the hunting lodge. And if you go down this canal, down to here, right in this area is where we have the release pen, where since 2011 we have been releasing whooping cranes in exactly the same way that we released them in Florida. But we don't have to worry about the wetlands drying up in Louisiana. They're absolutely vast. This is where the whooping cranes once were. You could ask, why didn't you put them there in the first place rather than Florida? The reason was the whooping crane recovery team was worried that they might connect with the birds from Aransas and attract them to stay in Louisiana, and this could be detrimental to our only known surviving wild flock. So the Florida experiment taught us how far these birds will range out. It turns out that they like to stay in the area where they were released pretty much. So when we started this program in 2011, we were much more confident that the released birds would not mix with the wild birds. So this is on that wetland, young birds in a holding pen. And last year we had the first nesting of the whooping crane in Louisiana since 1939. And this is a crawfish trap. They nested in a crawfish pond, not out in the big natural wild wetland. It's a really funny story. This farmer phones up to my colleague Sammy King, and he said, yeah, we've got some of these big white birds out in our crawfish pond, and they don't mind us at all. We go right by our boat to collect the crawfish out of the traps. There's a trap. And they don't even stand up on the nest if we go by, as long as we don't stop. And then if we do stop, they just walk off the nest a bit and then come right back to it. So just as the whooping cranes in Texas have become quite tame along the Intercoastal Canal in the winter, so have these whooping cranes in the crawfish fields. But this year we have several pairs that are building their nests in the wild wetlands at White Lake, as well as this pair. Now, when whooping cranes nest, that's when they lose their flight feathers, and they sort of grow them back as their chicks are growing up with them. And this pair, when that happens, they go out of breeding condition. They will not, like if they lose their eggs, they will not re-nest. They're putting all their energy into producing new feathers. But apparently this pair did not molt, and their eggs were infertile, which often happens in young pairs who have not learned to copulate completely correctly, as you can see from the video. But we're hoping this year they'll do better. So we collected the eggs, and they were infertile. 2 weeks later, they laid again, which is really extraordinary. It indicates that there's just a super abundance of food for these birds, and they're in great condition. So we are very hopeful that the releases in Louisiana are going to be successful. So, in review, we've had 4 experiments, 2 have failed, and 2 are in progress. Far away in Russia, we have a bird that looks very much like a whooping crane, but they have a much longer beak, and they have flute-like calls. This is the most endangered crane on Earth, although not the rarest. We have 4,000 of them. And they winter at a lake in China, one lake. In recent years, we lost all of the Siberian cranes in Western Asia that wintered in India and Iran because of the warfare in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The last birds were seen in India in 2003. We have 1 bird left coming to Iran. This little country called Azerbaijan became an independent country in 1990. And no longer received any financial help from Moscow. It's a big oil-producing country, and they put a pipeline through to Azerbaijan, but it was several years before it was completed. And during that period, there were food shortages in Azerbaijan, and they allowed hunting in the nature reserves, and we lost the Siberian cranes that came to Iran. But this flock numbers 4,000. They all winter at one lake in China. And now the government of China is threatening to put a dam across the outflow of the lake to increase the water 19 meters for navigation, which will, of course, make it too deep for wading birds. And that's a battle that we are fighting now in China with the help of many conservationists. Absolutely gorgeous bird. And the Russians have established a breeding center for Siberian cranes and are practicing flying with Siberian cranes because they hope someday, if peace ever comes to these flyways leading to Iran and India, that just as we've done from Wisconsin to Florida, they can bring back the Siberian cranes. Well, I'm going to end my talk here by an invitation. Number 1, we would like to give you a free membership in the International Crane Foundation if you will give us your name and address on a tablet on the table at the back. And we'll invite you to renew it in a year's time. We have 8,000 members, and we're supported by people like us. And I would like to invite you to think about joining me in Nebraska in early April of 2016 for a weekend to see the sandhill crane migration, and if we're lucky, some whooping cranes. And just put Nebraska beside your name, and we can send you the literature for that expedition. And as I mentioned before, in late February, we have our Whooping Crane Festival in Texas, and welcome you to join us for that too. In addition, I take small groups of people to 2 countries. I go to Mongolia in June for 10 days with 5 species of cranes, and in Bhutan, one of the most beautiful places on earth, every November for 2 weeks to travel from east to west across the whole country and to participate in the Festival of the Black-Necked Crane that migrates in from Tibet. Thank you very much.